So in the last video, we did an introduction to the definition of natural selection. We looked at VOCS, variation, overpopulation, competition, and slaughter. And these concepts are very important when we start to look at these memes, these ideas that we've constantly had about evolution. And one of the most common, let's see if I can find this. And one of the most common things that everyone teaches and learns about evolution is this idea that somehow these fish that were sitting there in water decided to just come up and climb up on land. Okay, and so we get this sort of progression right here, and evolution has constantly looked at this forward progress, right? And then we end up with animals like this that eventually evolved into mammals. And we see this even in very recent PBS documentaries on evolution, and this is from one of those.
And then there are mysterious fish that crawled onto land around 375 million years ago.
They just got...
And then there are mysterious...
These fish just got tired of being in the water, they saw some land, and they decided to crawl on top of it. This leaves out almost everything that we know whenever we look at a tidal pool or we see water flooding onto land. What happens so often, and this relates entirely with variation, overpopulation, competition, and slaughter. What we see all the time is sometimes you'll have these low-lying areas of land like this. And the water will come up and flood on top of this, right? When the water recedes, we end up with all these pools. And inside these pools, these could be 20 miles across, right? Are going to be sometimes thousands, even millions and millions of fish. And it's not clear that the water's ever going to return. Okay, so this might be a lake that's slowly drying out over hundreds or even thousands of years. And as it's drying out, it's killing off regular fish. And anything with sort of a variation that might allow it to survive better in this thinner and thinner water, this more mucky, dried up stuff, you know, that's flapping about even at a terrible life they're living, even in such a terrible life they're living, is going to survive, okay? And so at first, we just have massive, massive death. Okay, and those individuals that wouldn't make it in the regular world as regular fish that are just kind of strange, that might be better off on land, with the very random mutations, with these very rare and random mutations, are the ones that are just surviving just a little bit better, and the others are dying. Others are dying. And so this whole idea of fish crawling on land never happened. What happened is the water left the fish. Okay, so this eventually evaporated, or who knows what, the land shifted, and many millions, billions of fish died before you had individuals that were able to survive on land. So it's very important to think about this idea of natural selection as something that involves massive amounts of slaughter. Even when we talk about massive amounts of slaughter. And we'll look at this later in terms of greyhounds and in terms of how breeding is done, etc. But natural selection was never this very forward But natural selection was never this smooth kind of happy forward walk. Like this just involves everything to do with living, experimenting, enjoying life, where what we really had were millions and billions of fish flapping about, where there's no water, breathing and dying. Okay, and so these standard memes that we have of evolution, where we're just kind of always walking forward. Notice this is the direction we read in, right? Always forward, right? We were like this, we slowly got upright, and we eventually became like this. This involved death, massive amounts of slaughter. Slaughter and slaughter. Slaughter. And what's amazing is we can find this everywhere, right? We can see this actually happening, okay? So these are just modern pictures. We see the amounts of death. Every year, fish die when water leaves, droughts happen, etc. Some of them live longer than others. So if you have 20 million fish all dying, some of them are going to live 5 hours longer, 10 hours longer. Some might even survive for a week or etc. until the water comes back, then they go back and swim. Those are the ones that have been selected because they've had genes better for surviving in this sun area. And if they get trapped again, their children are more likely to survive. And if this becomes a constant event, they will eventually be the ones that can live on land. So all we need to do is look around and see these very same forces happening, today and generating individuals that are not the most sexy creatures on earth, but survive very well in these kind of survive very well in these areas where there's lots of drought, or where the water is just not consistent. Consistent. And so these are really the two big forces here. Variation, which gives you change, and slaughter, which gets rid of the individuals that are designed a certain way and maintains the individuals that might just survive a little bit better as the environment is changing. And remember, the environment is constantly changing. The average lifespan for islands on Earth is about 5 million years. Earth is pretty old, so these islands are popping up and dropping all the time. This is providing many places for animals to evolve, but it's also killing lots of animals that were on those islands at the time. And here we have the Panama Isthmus, which came up, I think, 7 million years ago. Very tragic story for the marsupials of South America, because it was full of marsupials and birds that didn't fly, and what came down were the cats, etc., and just wiped out most of the species in South America. This is because this little land isthmus came up. Earth changes all the time. You better be ready. And this has a lot to do with evolution, mutations, and deleterious genes, and how species respond to this really tragic thing that happens to their evolution of deleterious mutations. Deleterious mutations. Okay, so that's it for this video. We did a little Okay, so that's it for this video. We've looked at some of the memes of evolution, and we started to punch a hole in them, and we've really begun to understand this idea of slaughter. Massive, massive slaughter. And we've really begun to understand this idea that we talked about in the last video of slaughter. Massive amounts of slaughter, and how fish did not walk on land, and chimpanzees didn't just warmly become humans. There was a lot of death involved. There was a lot of death involved. So no species evolves without massive death. No species evolves without massive amounts of death.